Hello and welcome to another special edition of the British Broadcasting Century on things you can go to this summer of 2026. This time from radio to television and the cultures of early television. A University of Westminster conference at London's Portland Hall this 2nd and 3rd of July, convened by Professor John Wyver. You'll hear from John this episode. He's the author of the marvellous book Magic Rays of Light. He's arranged this conference for anyone interested in early television. I guess that's anything pre-World War II. And by the end of this episode, you'll be interested in early television if you weren't before. We're leaping for this episode from radio to TV, here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, welcome to the British Broadcasting Century podcast. I'm Paul Carenza, a little bit hoarse this time, you may have noticed. I'm 4 weeks post-stroke. Apparently hoarseness is one of the things that can happen with strokes, but thanks to marvellous therapists and medication and joy and support and the messages for which I am most grateful, I'm doing okay. But one of those impacts is slightly less research time than usual, so our moment-by-moment chronology of what happened when in the earliest days of British broadcasting will continue in about a month's time from now. We currently find ourselves mid-November 1923. The next tale from there will be the launch of the Sheffield Relay Station. Our guest will be Andrew Barker. So once you hear from him, you'll know we're back to normal. Meantime, summer has a slightly different vibe to it in any case because there are things on. So for 3 episodes, we bring you interviews with people behind them. Last episode, we spoke to Mitch Benn, comedian and the voice behind Ask Elvis that was on BBC Radio 2's Steve Wright in the Afternoon. Mitch Benn is presenting a comedy show called Asking Elvis. It's on Edinburgh Festival this August and there are preview shows all June and July of 2026. Next time, we're all about the Archers. They're doing a live show to celebrate 75 years. And we'll speak to Angela Barnes, the comedian and host of the Archers live show. This time we're looking at early television and a conference that is not just for academia. It's for anyone interested in the cultures of early television. The title of the conference, the website you can go to for more, we'll put the link in the show notes. But if you were to put into a search engine, the cultures of early television, John Wyver, you'll find out all about it, as you will this episode. It's a wonderful discussion. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And also coming up within that, a couple of little tidbits on a great, wonderful, pioneering friends of mine, Arthur Burrows, first voice of the BBC, and Peter Eckersley, its esteemed first chief engineer. I say friends, they never knew me. I feel like they're friends. So stay tuned for a little bit of them and a lot of Professor John Wyver, and also coming up a little bit on the end of Longwave here in the United Kingdom. It has a closing down date. It's the end of June 2026, and we'll tell you about another event that's being put on by Cray Valley Radio Society, and indeed, you can listen where you are to the end of Longwave. How very sad. All that coming up, but first of all, let's meet today's special guest, Professor John Wyver. Delighted to welcome to the podcast now a guest I've been looking forward to chatting to for quite some time. He is indeed Professor of the Arts on Screen at the University of Westminster. His book is Magic Rays of Light, and he is Professor John Wyver. Thank you for joining us, John.
Thank you for the invitation, Paul. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, you've got a book and we've got a conference is coming. Maybe we should bookend by talking about the conference so people know now when it is, and we could always say a bit more at the end as to what it is as well. When is the conference? This is all early television, isn't it?
Yes, the conference is on the 2nd and 3rd of July in London at Portland Hall. University of Westminster conference organised with the invaluable support of the British Academy. It's called The Cultures of Early Television, and it's 2 days looking not really at the technology of early television, because I feel that the history of early television, and by early television, I'm at the moment thinking about pre-Second World War television. Mm-hmm. I think that history has very largely been told in terms of the technology and a bit in terms of the institution of the BBC. And actually, for reasons that we can talk about, there's been very little focus on the programs, the broadcasts, and in the people who made those broadcasts. And so I'm really interested in trying to focus on those programs, on what was made, on how it was made, and also in trying to develop an international dialogue about that. Because again, I think this history has been told rather in sort of national silos, so that people have written about television in Britain or television in the United States, or a little bit, not so much, about television in continental Europe and elsewhere. And I'm really keen to bring some historians and archivists together to see if there are elements of crossover and comparison and difference. So that's what we're doing on these 2 days. It's an academic conference, but I hope it's a conference that will be of interest to anybody who's got a concern or is intrigued by the story of broadcasting, particularly broadcasting in the interwar years, and also the social history of Britain in those years. Registration's free. There are places available. There's an Eventbrite page that you can sign up to, and we'd be delighted to have any of your listeners along.
Brilliant stuff. Brilliant. Yes, listeners, not viewers, of course, because we're mixing the media as we speak. Exactly. Yeah, quite right. Yes, it's called The Cultures of Early Television. We'll put the link in the show notes as well. I will mention it again towards the end of the episode. Leaping off also the book you've done, which of course is tied in with a centenary. There seems to be are there several centenaries? I don't know. It's sort of like 1926 is a big one, isn't it?
There are several anniversaries, certainly. I think 26 is a significant one. It's 100 years in last January, since John Logie Baird, one of the inventors of television, not in any sense, the only begetter, but one of the figures who was working with early technology. In January 1926, Baird gave a public demonstration, the first public demonstration of what he called true television, which was the transmission of moving grayscale images. So not just black and white graphics, but actually moving images transmitted as a 30-line image along a wire at that point. And that he felt that was the beginning of the public engagement with television. And that's an event that has been kind of recognized ever since. There's a blue plaque on the building in Frith Street, which is now Bar Italia. And so that's the centenary. In November, it's the 90th anniversary of the start of the television service, the high-definition television service by the BBC from Alexandra Palace. So that's another significant anniversary. And indeed, yesterday, the day before us recording this podcast, it was the 80th anniversary of the restart of television from Alexandra Palace after it had shut down during the Second World War. So yeah, it's a good moment to be talking about these things.
Wow, lots at once, though, isn't it? Lots at once. Yeah, it's incredible. And I was fascinated to see just how many mentions of television, almost as an idea, in some sort of magazines or newspaper articles back in the 20s and really early. I mean, I noticed some people have talked about television. Just looking at your conference thing, you've got the sort of dates in the 19th century, people talking about the idea of things beginning. It seems to be in the ether, so to speak, early on.
I think there was always a fascination with this idea of seeing at a distance, and there was particularly that fascination once the telephone had been invented and started to get kind of currency. There was the idea that you could hear somebody at that moment simultaneously at a distance, and therefore why wouldn't there be a technology which would allow you to see them as well? And so, yeah, speculative fiction writers and scientists from certainly the 1880s onwards were exploring the kind of fantasy of television.
Oh, yes, in terms of the predictions of television, you can go back to 1880 and the Telephote, 1904 and the Televista. And perhaps the first mention of television itself comes from 1907 and Windsor magazine. Television is not impossible in theory. In practice, it will be very costly without being capable of serious application. But we do not want that. On that day, when it will be possible to accelerate our methods of telephotography by at least 10 times, which does not appear to be impossible in the future, we shall arrive at television with 100 telegraph wires. And I particularly enjoyed this from our good friend Arthur Burrows, first voice of the BBC, the first director of programmes at the BBC, and who I like to think of as sort of radio prophet. In 1917, he wrote an extensive article for the Yearbook of Wireless Telegraphy and Telephony and tried to foresee what the future was for wireless. And Burrows said, "The nightmare of wireless television is unlikely to become a reality for some time. Such an invention would be of questionable popularity, and its commercial application limited." Yeah, Burrows did not see a future for television just yet. A little more from his arch-nemesis Peter Eckersley coming up as well shortly.
In the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, there are a bunch of films which imagine what television might be. Interestingly, they don't always, or indeed very rarely, do they get the sort of broadcast form of television right. Television in those early fantasies is often what we would think of now as visual telephony, the idea of speaking to somebody and seeing them on the screen at the same time. Or it's forms of television that are used for surveillance or for criminal detection or whatever. And actually the broadcast form of television, obviously modelled on a radio form of television, kind of coheres rather later than the idea that you might be able to see someone at the same time at a distance.
So I'm guessing those very early experiments in Baird in 1926 and so on must have been quite technical and experimental. But how early do we get some sort of recognisable programme, whether it's something we would still recognise today as, oh yeah, we have dancing or stories, or some of those things that just didn't really persist?
I think the first programme is, in fact, in 1928 at Radio Olympia, the trade fair that was held annually for both retailers but also the public to see the latest radio sets and other forms of technology. In 1928, the Baird company puts on a demonstration, a closed circuit demonstration. So this is just on wires from a small studio to some viewing rooms on the edges of Radio Olympia. They put on a schedule of variety acts and interviews with an announcer, a kind of presentation figure between them, people singing songs, telling jokes, doing very basic elements of visual comedy, essentially. But it is, I think you could argue, it is the first kind of variety show for television. You've got to remember the pictures at this point are incredibly crude. So we're talking about screens that are at best the size of a postcard. They're portrait format, so they're taller than they are wider, like TikTok now.
Well, I was thinking how far we've come when you say about no bigger than a postcard, and I've just been watching a film on my phone, and you think that is smaller than a postcard, so we've returned, haven't we?
It was very much, of course, you couldn't pick up the set, but it was very much like looking at a screen the size of your mobile phone. The image was very crude, so it was a 30-line image rather than the analogy of high definition with over 1,000 lines in your television image now. This was a 30-line image. It was black and white, or probably quite often it was sort of sepia or a sort of pale blue. And the lines were vertical, so the lines went up and down rather than horizontal. At the beginning, you could recognize things, but there was a sense that actually recognizing a face or recognizing a figure or recognizing an object like a pipe or a pen was part of the achievement. You know, that actually that was a big deal at the very beginning. So these are very, very crude things, but at the same time, the fact that an object or a person could be seen moving, and you knowing that was happening at the same moment as you were watching it in another room or across the road or wherever, that was magical. It's quite hard to capture the sort of sense of how remarkable this experience was for the first viewers.
More from Professor John Wyver shortly on his conference, on his book Magic Rays of Light, and on the history of early television right back to the 20s and 30s. But a break from television for a moment to consider radio longwave and its end. 27th of June 2026 has been named as the long-promised date when the BBC switches off longwave transmitters, earlier than many thought, but it's lasted a good century or so. There's a couple of wonderful blogs we'll link to in the show notes. Random Radio Jottings and Andy Walmsley there. They've written a marvellous one, noting that just 5 countries in the world are still left broadcasting on longwave. That'll be Romania, Poland, Morocco, Algeria and Mongolia. So yeah, 6th on that list was United Kingdom. And it closes 27th of June. So to mark the occasion, Cray Valley Radio Society, Dave Lawley has been in touch about what they are up to. They've got a special station operating on the 26th and the 27th of June. They've got a special call sign for those few days of GB198LW. Now, of course, 198LW, longwave, has been the frequency of longwave for quite some time in this country. The BBC itself began broadcasting longwave in July 1924, inaugurated by its chief engineer Peter Eckersley, more of him later. It was from Chelmsford then. It was from July 1925 in Daventry, 5XX. Upgraded then when Droitwich launched in September 1934. And a couple of years before that, Westerglen in Scotland from 32 and Berghead in Scotland from 1936. And those 3 stations will be closing down at the same time later this month. If Radio Ham call signs are your thing, then other call signs you can listen out for: GB198END, end, and GB198KHZ, 198 kilohertz being the frequency of BBC Longwave, of course. They'll be operated by 2 Scottish clubs. So you can listen out for those amateur transmissions. You could tune in for the very end of Longwave. You can pop in, though, as well to see Cray Valley Radio Society in person at the Scout Hall in Eltham, in South East London on Saturday the 27th of June. It's open to visitors from 10 until 5, and you can see their selection of vintage radio receivers on display there as well. Longwave itself then, I won't get into the technical details here, but culturally, what has it offered us? The shipping forecast, home to Test Match Special, the daily service that I still present now as it moved over to 4 Extra. It's been radio calibration. It's reached Royal Navy submarines. Longwave has even sent secret coded messages to the French resistance in World War II. It was home to the Light programme from 1945 to 78, and then it switched in 1978 to be the home of Radio 4, where it has been to this day. Of course, FM and DAB and online and all of these things are still with us. But longwave will stop. There has been issues as well to do with how longwave transmits information to energy meters for some people. We're just going to hope that all works out somehow. The whole point of it was these low-frequency radio waves mean the entire UK can be covered by a single longwave transmitter, reaching nearly all the population and even further to the European continent and out to sea. Like I said, lots of good blogs about it. You can read all of the details if you'd like to, thanks to the Radio Society of Great Britain, Random Radio Jottings, and Atlantic 252 have got a blog as well. So, raise your glasses on the 27th of June to the end of BBC Longwave. From radio back to television, we return you to the man behind the Cultures of Early Television conference, coming up on 2nd and 3rd of July, and author of Magic Rays of Light. It's Professor John Wyver. 1936, the BBC launches the first high-definition service. But what's the relationship like between Baird and the BBC in those years up to that?
So the relationship between the Baird company, which in Britain, initiates these first programmes and these first outputs. The Baird company, because it wants to sell its own receiving sets, called televisors, starts putting on a fairly regular programme of broadcasts from the autumn of 1928 onwards, and it gets singers and dancers and so forth to contribute to a half hour of broadcasts 2 or 3 evenings a week, which was shown to a very small number of people who'd got one of these televisors or who had built a televisor. The BBC is initially very, very sniffy about this. Their chief engineer thinks that the system is far too crude, that it can't be the basis of any kind of entertainment system.
Oh, now, John mentions the chief engineer of the BBC. That is, of course, our good friend Peter Eckersley. through the merry dance between the BBC and the Baird Company and this general development of television, I think it's fair to say that Eckersley varied between suspicion and downright anger towards the Baird Company. They didn't exactly get along. But here's a nice thing I saw. I was reading Prospero's Wireless, biography of Peter Eckersley by his son Miles Eckersley, and it mentions that in 1928, on the 28th of October, Peter Eckersley was actually one of the first faces on television. It's an experimental transmission. You've got the Baird Company at Longacre in Covent Garden, and the BBC, of course, down at Savoy Hill, not too far down the road. And there you'd find John Reith and Lord Clarendon and one or two others crouched around this 3-inch by 2.5-inch screen, waiting to see some faces. It says here the first actor to appear was Jack Buchanan. Some comedians soon followed him, then some conjurers. Love to see some early magic tricks on television there. And then Peter Eckersley suddenly appeared and said a few words. The book says, I can't imagine what he said. No, I do wonder. Shame that none of this was recorded. It says, afterwards the press lauded the test and commented on the BBC engineers jealously trying to abort a promising invention. Well, we all know how it turned out. I think the BBC and television, firm friends today.
Of course, the BBC is still at a very early stage. It's only 6, 7, 8 years into its existence, but it's becoming very powerful, very confident as a sound broadcaster. And initially, it's really sniffy about this upstart. But at the same time, it doesn't want to see the emergence of some kind of rival broadcasting system. So it keeps quite close tabs on it. It begins slowly to form a relationship. It allows the Baird Company to use its transmitters to broadcast these programs around 3031. And then in 1932, it takes over the broadcasting from the Baird Company. And John Logie Baird always regretted that they had given, effectively, the possibility of these broadcasts to the BBC. But at the same time, he recognised that his company, and then quite quickly Gaumont British, which took over his company, wanted to make money by selling sets. There wasn't any money in making programmes. It wanted to sell receivers, and therefore it sort of made financial sense for the BBC to do that. So from 32 to 35, the BBC, under a producer called Eustace Robb, who's a major pioneer, no one's kind of heard of him, recognises him, whatever, but he develops a really quite sophisticated television service, broadcasting 4 nights a week, half an hour, late night. Again, a lot of comedy, variety, but also a lot of dance. He's very interested in the kind of emerging British ballet world, and he gets major dancers to appear on the screen. Alicia Markova and others who had worked with the Ballet Russe in the 1920s, as well as doing the beginnings of some kind of discussions and even art exhibitions on screen. And Rob runs this service to 35, when the government recognises that actually there's something significant emerging here, but it's probably not going to develop properly with these very basic 30-line broadcasts. So they've put together a committee of inquiry and decide that the BBC should run a high definition, that is a 405-line service from what turns out to be Alexandra Palace, which starts in November 1936.
Gosh.
And that's the sort of moment that people think of in a way as the beginning of television. But I'm really interested in those broadcasts that Rob and others do earlier in the 1930s. And although we've got almost no moving image record of that, we've got fragments that have been rescued from audio discs that recorded them, seconds of them. I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to those very early broadcasts. After 1936, we've got the beginnings of some kind of film record, at least, of some of the broadcasts, and there's much more documentation and engagement and interest. Between 36 and 39, the BBC puts out a daily broadcast twice a day between 3 and 4 and 9 and 10 of variety, drama, outside broadcasts, the whole range, and the sort of the basic elements of what we think of as television, including the first soap opera and the first situation comedy. They're all established between 36 and 39.
So much there that we could unpack and talk about. I'm hoping as well in time, if we ever get that far with this podcast, to, I love taking the moment by moment, almost day by day, what happened when, and so much of this, there's so much here that I need to learn about, certainly, because if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have thought it probably started in 1953. And
I think many people still think it started with the coronation, essentially.
Yeah. And I think even probably 2 years ago, I would have thought 1936. And then now I know very much differently. So you mentioned, interestingly, the 32 that the BBC took over, which I wasn't aware of. But the same year then, you've got Broadcasting House and the Empire Service. I mean, that's a huge year for the BBC to sort of shed behind its first decade and suddenly go, right, we're doing all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, it's only 10 years since the formation of the British Broadcasting Company under a man John Reith, who kind of recognised, I think, as he went to an interview to run it, that he didn't really even know what radio was. So that is an extraordinarily rapid development, and it demonstrates remarkable confidence in what the BBC thought it could do and what place it felt it had in the nation, in its political and cultural and social life. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, on which then maybe you can either dispel or confirm a few myths or truths that I've heard about these sort of early things. So one is that John Reith didn't like television and never watched it. Another is that the early viewers of the BBC service were a very small amount of quite posh people. What can you tell us about any of those things?
Well, I certainly Reith, I don't think he was actively hostile to it, but I don't think he was very interested in it. By the mid-1930s, he, established this extraordinary phenomenon in his own image, really, with its own beliefs about its social place and its religious significance, its moral significance. But I don't think he was actively hostile, and I don't think he tried to stay its development in any sense. I think, like many people, he actually didn't think it was very important. And I think that right through until the post-war years, the figures at Broadcasting House who are running the BBC don't really see television as very significant. And the fact that television is set up in Alexandra Palace, quite a long way from Broadcasting House. I mean, it's still a 40-minute journey by tube and bus or whatever. So there's a kind of real distance there. And the lack of interest and the distance allows the first director of television of the High Definition Service, Gerald Cock, to have significant autonomy to make programmes in the way that he wants to do it and in the way that his producers want to do it. And that allows them to be very innovative, to create really, really, I think, bold and interesting, sometimes completely bonkers programmes that just simply don't work. But nonetheless, there's the possibility of television being developing rapidly in its own terms. Yes, it's a small audience. So when the High Definition Service goes on the air in November 1936, there are maybe 400 sets in London that can receive it. And that audience grows initially very slowly. And there's a lot of concern in 36, 37, beginning of 38, about the size of the audience and the resources that are being used to send programs to a few thousand people. After Radio Olympia, the trade fair in the autumn of 1938, viewership grows quite rapidly. And in the last year of its existence, before it shuts down at the beginning of September 1939, there's quite a significant growth in the number of sets that are sold. Even so, there are only about 20,000 sets in the London area, because that's the only place pretty much that the signals can reach. There are 20,000 sets in operation when the service shuts down. So a viewership of 60 to 80,000 people. Are they all posh? They're certainly well off, most of them. Buying a television was not cheap, and there wasn't a way of renting it before the war. So radio rentals was operating, but as its name suggests, it allowed you to rent radio sets, but not television sets. Although it started that after that possibility after the war. So even in those final months, it cost you 35 guineas to buy a television set. A few months earlier, certainly in 38, it pretty much cost you 70 guineas to buy a television set. And that wasn't far off the cost of a small family car. So this was a real luxury item. And it was sort of pitched at middle class, or the sort of top end of a middle class audience, who had that kind of disposable income by and large. And some of the programs reflect that. The fashion shows are constructed for people who are going grouse shooting or going to the Eton and Harrow cricket match at Lord's. These are not horny-handed sons of toil, as it were, that are being addressed by this. Equally, the first cook on television, Marcel Boulestin, there's one program where he cooks partridge smitan. Well, partridge smitan is not a dish that those living in the East End are going to regularly conjure up on their stoves. So, it's definitely a middle to upper class audience. That said, we have very few records of the reactions to television by individual viewers. We have the reactions of people professionally involved in television, but very few people kept any kind of diary or talked about watching television. There is an invaluable interview in Radio Times with a man called George Boar, Boar, who was an agricultural labourer in Suffolk, right on the edges of the area where you think you could pick up television signals. And he, in 38, used a legacy to buy a television set, erect an aerial, and as a working class farmhand, watched and loved television and would invite his neighbours in to watch. He became known in the village as Mr. Television. He left a little basket on the top of his television for people to throw an odd coin or two into when they came to watch. And so it wasn't exclusively a very upscale audience. It was to some degree mixed.
I think we might have to have you back because I've got a funny feeling there's more to talk about. But actually, one thing you mentioned about the TV cook thing. I another claimant I've maybe for the first TV cook. I've been trying to write this biography about Moira Main, who I did this who did just a one-off, I think, cookery demonstration.
That's right.
And so rather selfishly, I wonder if I use some of our remaining minutes to ask about her, because I'm trying to research her a bit. And then, so I did this Radio 4 drama last year, and I fictionalised a bit of Alexandra Palace and hopefully got some details half right. That
honestly, that story far better than I. I don't think I can add anything.
Well, I think all I was doing was looking at things like, I tried to look at the weeks of it going, okay, this was when it was the Baird Company was Marconi, and I think it was Marconi week, and they had slightly better cameras, I think, so they could move, and they had those sorts of things. So maybe she picked the right week.
I can talk about that, absolutely. So this government committee in 1935-36 decides that the BBC will run television, but it can't decide between what have emerged as two competing technologies for making programs and transmitting them. Baird's essentially mechanical system, which by 1936 has developed so that it can create 240 line images, and the kind of newcomer, EMI, big industrial conglomerate, that has been developing an electronic system to make 405 line images. The committee has a certain kind of loyalty to Baird and to its kind of his sort of national pride in a way. But they also recognise the claim of EMI. So they tell the BBC that they have to start by working with both systems and to begin having a week of programmes made by the Baird system and a week made by the EMI system. And this they begin in November 1936. Very quickly, it's apparent that the Baird system is a nightmare. It's unreliable. It produces less good pictures. It's very inflexible. You can't move the camera and so forth. And so by January 37, the BBC decides that it can only go ahead with the EMI system. But November, December, January, the two systems work in parallel and with 1 week on, 1 week off. And if you were lucky, or if you had a broadcast of some ambition, then that broadcast was made in an EMI week rather than a Baird week. And I think your cook, who, as you say, does the first programme, but then isn't followed up, she's in an EMI week. And that probably means that the broadcast worked, didn't break down, and was a rather better experience for viewers.
Well, I read somewhere that the quality may have been better, so therefore I don't know if there's I can't remember if I read it or fictionalized it. It's the problem with not making notes. But therefore, the skin texture might be a little clearer. So I got to play a sniffy receptionist who's sort of going, well, I hope you've done your skincare regime sort of thing, just to really make her even more nervous as she goes in, going, oh no, it's going to show up and everything. Yeah. But we've barely had enough time to. Her daughter Anne Twigg was also doing early television and was the first person to play Anne Boleyn on screen in the summer after, doing that Tudor touch. So lots of period drama was a big thing, wasn't it? I mean, I should mention as well your beautiful book, Magic Rays of Light, with a wonderful cover. I'm going to hold up just only you can see it. But Starlight, isn't it? The picture leaps off the page there.
Yeah, and I wanted to use that, which is a painting called Starlight by a man called Harry Rutherford, who used to do live cartooning on television. So he hung around the studios at Alexandra Palace, sketching and doing drawings and so forth. He painted that in 1937. It's a painting that lives on the wall of the Britain Archive Centre in Caversham, the BBC's reading room. It's kind of glamorous and exciting, and it's colourful, and it's not got that sort of heavy black and white technology focused sense, which is what I wanted to get away from in a way in the book as a whole. So I was very pleased when the estate of the painter allowed me to reproduce it on the cover.
Wonderful. The picture itself on the cover of John's book is well worth a Google. His book, Magic Rays of Light, you can look for that, or you can search for the picture. It's called Starlight, Steve Garay and Magda Kuhn. And those are the two actors who are there in period costume. They are filming a piece at Alexandra Palace called Starlight. The painting itself was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1938, and essentially the big version of the picture, you've got these two actors right in the middle being filmed with a camera on wheels. You've got one or two other people in period costume just out of shot, and then two or three others who are clearly crew, smartly dressed outside, a couple of lights there shining on, but no real set apart from one Regency chair. But it shows colour, and it shows simplicity and a sense of the story that they are trying to tell. The stars themselves were actually married, and if we look at the BBC Programme Index, you can find that actually this was broadcast on the 23rd of March 1937 and the 16th of April that year and the 7th of December. Of course, they didn't repeat in the way we would imagine it, so they restage it when they want it aired again. I don't know exactly which of those three dates this painting was originating from, but at some point in 1937, Harry Rutherford was there painting them as they were performing. And as John says, Harry Rutherford's own show was called Cabaret Cartoons. He would draw artistes live on the air as they performed their cabaret act, with Rutherford mute throughout. partly because the producer, Cecil Madden, thought that Harry Rutherford's Manchester accent may be unsuitable for broadcast. Yeah, times have changed a little bit. A couple of decades later, Harry Rutherford returns to television to host a programme called Sketchbook. Apparently the first children's art programme, the ancestor of Take Heart and Art Attack. Cue the gallery music. Do, 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 do. Television's relationship to cinema, and if one was a bit sniffy about the other, I don't know.
I think the relationship between the cinema industry and television in the 1930s is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. The kind of hostility towards television and the concern that television is going to destroy the film industry really doesn't emerge until after the war, when television begins to become a mass medium. And in fact, there's a great deal of fascination by the film industry in television and in what television might be able to offer to the film industry. Baird, from the very beginning, saw that television might be something that could be installed in cinemas for live broadcasts. And Gaumont British, one of the big cinema chains, picks up and develops this idea in the 1930s, developing the idea of what's called cinema television, with the idea that there could be live broadcasts of royal occasions, sporting events, but also variety shows created for presentation live on large screens in cinemas. And by 1939, that becomes a really significant possibility. There's a very well-attended and highly publicised boxing match in early 1939 that gets shown in 3 cinemas. By the September, there are 7 cinemas in London that are equipped for showing television on a large screen. And there are plans for many more, and it's only the war that shuts that down.
The Cultures of Early Television is the upcoming conference, 2nd of July, Thursday and Friday, 3rd of July. And whether you are academic, historian, amateur, I'm hoping to make it along if I can. And you put it together. So I'll put the link in the show notes again. People can Google it and find out, I'm sure.
Look forward to seeing you there.
My thanks to Professor John Wyver. What a guest he is, so knowledgeable, and I feel we have barely scratched the surface. I think we're going to have to try and lure him back if we possibly can. Meanwhile, I really recommend his book. It's published by BFI, the British Film Institute, so that merry dance between television and cinema. The BFI are publishing the book on television. It's called Magic Rays of Light, the Early Years of Television in Britain, and his conference, The Cultures of Early Television. I'm hoping to go to it myself. It's put on by the University of Westminster. It's 2nd and 3rd of July at Portland Hall in London. Looking at the list of what's on, various guests including Professor Jamie Medhurst, friend of the show, Dr. Kate Murphy, we've heard from her on here before, Simon Vaughan from the Alexandra Palace Television Society, Stephen Bourne, who we've heard from on the podcast as well before, loads of other guests, and you can be there as well. And health permitting, I hope to be there on the Friday. If I see you there, do say hello. Next time on the podcast, one more interview about an event that is upcoming that you can go to in person this summer of 2026. And it's comedian Angela Barnes who'll be hosting The Archers at 75, touring theatres around the land, celebrating 3/4 of a century of The Archers. You've also got this summer Cray Valley Radio Society in Eltham. You could pop in and join them for the end of Radio 4 Longwave. You've got last episode, we mentioned Mitch Ben's Asking Elvis, and also my own touring show, An Evening of Very Old Radio. It visits Weston-super-Mare on Wednesday the 29th of July. That's a rescheduled date. Do come to that if you're near Weston. And a brand new date in the diary as well, Westbury Festival in Wiltshire, Thursday 23rd of July. So if you live in Westbury or Weston-super-Mare or anywhere with West in the name, do consider coming along to An Evening of Very Old Radio. And do consider, if you want to get more stuck in with this podcast, joining our Patreon page, patreon.com/Paul Carenza. For $5 a month, you get loads of writings and videos and behind-the-scenesy things, and the joy of supporting this podcast without wanting to pull on the heartstrings at all. Since my stroke, I've had to cancel a lot of my live work, which I couldn't do, of course. I can't drive at the moment. So I'm ever more reliant on things like Patreon. So if you're a patron on there, thank you so much for supporting this podcast. I would love to invest more time and focus into just this podcast if possible, which would require a lot more patrons. But if you fancy chipping in and joining us and helping us out, patreon.com/Paul Carenza is where you can do that. Or indeed, you can rate and review us. We've had some lovely comments out there online. Maybe we'll read a few out one week. That might be quite a nice thing to do. You can share this podcast on various social media of your choice or with just friends, anecdotally, over a pint of ale, which I currently can't drink because I'm not allowed to. So let's say a glass of Peckham Spring water. Thank you for joining us. Do subscribe if you haven't. And next time, The Archers at 75 will be yours here on the British Broadcasting Century. Presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. Do find us on Facebook. We have a group and a page. You can join both if you like. I don't fully understand it. We're also on Blue Sky, which is like Twitter, but kinda. You can find Paul Carenza on Instagram, and he has a mailing list, don't you know? If you were to Google Paul Carenza and mailing list, and you can find out upcomings like live shows and radio broadcasts like his future pauses for thought, daily services, and slightly ruder transmissions, including his episodes of Not Going Out when that's broadcast. Filthy. Yeah, all right, it's a weird world writing sitcoms and doing religious broadcasting, but someone's got to do it. Well, they don't, but I do. Anyway, this is my joy. It's so lovely to be with you, not broadcasting, but podcasting, where next time it's The Archers, here on the British Broadcasting Century.